I was the kid who struggled. And I was the teacher that went into this really not knowing. I know it sounds silly, but feeling like I was going to fail these little 7 and 8 year old boys and girls because that's how much fear and anxiety I had. And it was through that first year of teaching, I taught second grade math science, that I fell in love with teaching math.
So to talk a little bit about your book, I really loved the idea of it, and the title really caught me because it said a confident math teacher's guide was there in the title. And from just talking to you a little bit, you didn't always feel this way. And so your book talks about having some math anxiety growing up. And I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, myself included. Once I hit a certain age, I felt like that really crept in. So I just wanted to ask, what was that like for you growing up? Do you remember, was it something specific that caused the anxiety or when it started to show up?
Yeah, so I can't really pinpoint an exact age or grade where my math anxiety started. I do remember being in maybe third or fourth grade, and that's when I realized that I didn't fully understand math like a lot of my peers did. And it kind of was around that time frame when I started to realize or felt like I wasn't smart because the things that were being taught I didn't understand. And so that anxiety started at such a young age, and it kind of carried over into middle school and into high school. And the older I got, and in my book I say when math begins to switch from using numbers into using letters, that's when my anxiety would really set in. So I just kind of a little background. I have always lived in a very rural area. And so if I'm being honest, when I got into middle school and high school, my math teachers were probably always a football coach or some type of other coach just because I lived in such a small area. So when I started to make that shift in that transition, I just didn't understand it. It felt like I was just I can't even really like describe how I was feeling. And I remember that I would look at my math book, and what I remember from math growing up typically is that a teacher would display a part of a workbook or the textbook when you got into middle school and high school, and they would essentially just read what was on the page, and then you would do the independent practice part independently. For elementary, I remember we would do half of the workbook page together, and then we would do the second half of the workbook page. We would have to do that independently. And I always dreaded that independent part because I just felt overwhelmed. I did not understand what was being taught. And thankfully, my mother was a upper elementary and middle school math teacher at the time. And if I didn't have her, I would have struggled even more than what I did because I had that parental support at home. And that anxiety carried over into college. I was the kid that had to take I had to take 2 remedial math classes before I could take college algebra. And I remember it was my first semester of college, and I was on a cheerleading scholarship. And it was my first semester. I was taking this remedial pre-algebra class, whatever the name of it was. And I remember sitting in the floor of my dorm room, and I have this textbook open, and tears are just streaming down my face. I don't understand what's going on. And back in this time, iPhones were not a thing yet. So there wasn't FaceTime. I couldn't just video call my mom to ask for help. I was essentially on my own, it was one of those situations where I would try to go to my professor or some kind of tutor, and there it was just kind of, oh, like you'll just figure it out, or you aren't learning it because you have no desire to learn it. There was no help in that area, and I really just kind of felt like I was on my own. And I remember sitting in my dorm room and tears are just streaming down my face because if I didn't pass this test that was coming up, I was going to lose my cheerleading scholarship. I was going to fail. Right. And I remember just sitting there and tears are streaming down my face, and it was really probably one of the first times that I recognized that I was having some sort of anxiety attack over something that I just didn't understand. And I felt dumb. I felt stupid because everyone around me, and I would go to these peer tutoring sessions, and everyone around me seemed to kind of catch on really quickly with just a little bit of extra help, and that was not the case for me. And if I'm being honest, I think I barely scraped by because maybe they just felt sorry for me. I don't know. But I just remember realizing from a very young age, probably third or fourth grade, that I did not learn the way that my peers learned. And then once I learned that, that carried on with me into middle school, high school, and even into college. And then once I kind of got into the position that I'm in now, I started learning that it really wasn't just me. And there's a ton of research and mathematical statistics out there that were shocking to me with people in my age, the millennial generation, that they didn't understand. And so what happens when a child doesn't understand, they tend to just get passed over and passed over and passed over a little bit. And eventually they just fall further and further behind. Well, luckily for me, I had my mom who could help me. But I think as educators, we know that that's not the majority of the students that we have, and that the lack of parental support at home, depending on the area that you live in, can be hit or miss. And if I didn't have that support, I would have struggled even more.
Yeah, I think that's going to be validating for a lot of listeners, because I think it almost feels like there must be something wrong with you, right, that you don't understand. And I remember as a little kid feeling pretty smart, like in elementary school, until we got to a certain point in math and it was just like a wall. So I think it's an experience a lot of people have had. And so it's exciting to know that there's maybe an alternative, a different way that it could be done and taught, to people. So it sounds like it affected you through college, and then like you became a teacher. So was it, yeah, was it pretty soon, like, into your teaching career that you realized something had to change? Like, were you seeing the same pattern with some of your students?
I was. I'm going to kind of, because it all kind of ties in, and I actually share this in the first chapter of my book. The first chapter is essentially talking about my experience with math anxiety growing up and how that transitioned into teaching. I wasn't always an education major. I actually went into college from the time I was little. I always told myself I wanted to be a photographer. Oh. And that's what I went to college to do. And a part of me, I remember, I'm sitting in this room and I'm crying and I'm like, I don't need to know how to do this to take pictures. And then it was just a few short months later, I called my mom, who I mentioned before, and she was a upper elementary, middle school math teacher. And I called her and I said, I think that I might change my major. And I'm going to be honest, she tried to talk me out of it.
She was like, are you sure?
She was like, are you sure that this is what you want to do? And she was very supportive. But growing up with a mom who is an educator, I did see the stress levels that teachers can have, as far as workload and, what it is like to work with different types of administrations and, handling student behavior and parents and all of the aspects that come along with not just teaching. And so while she was supportive, she wanted to make sure that I knew what I was fully getting into. And ultimately, I ended up, deciding. And I shared this story in the book. I'm actually at my parents' house. I had just wrapped up my first year of teaching. At that particular time, I lived about 5 hours away from home. And I was wanting to move closer to where I had grew up. So I applied at the same district that my mom worked in. And I thought that I was going to be hired for a third grade position. That's what I interviewed for. So when they called me, the administrator at the time was like, "We would love to hire you, but we're going to make a change." And they said, "Instead of hiring you to be third grade self-contained, our elementary school is making a shift, and it was going to be or second through fourth grade. Instead of being self-contained, they were now going to be departmentalized."
Okay.
And they said, "We want to hire you to teach second grade math." And on the phone, I probably sounded really excited. I'm like, "Yes, like I would love to do this. Thank you for the opportunity." And I remember hanging up the phone. I'm sitting on my parents' front porch on these steps that they have. And I'm sitting there and I hang up the phone and my heart is just, it's pounding. I start sweating and I'm immediately, I'm not regretting my decision, but I'm thinking to myself, I just verbally agreed to do something, and I don't know if I can do this. At the time, I'm 23 years old. I'm still learning, all of the things, but ultimately, I ended up taking the position, and it was the best thing I ever did, because what I learned about myself is through my struggles with math growing up, it's actually a lot easier for me to teach. I can break things down in really tangible ways and I relate to students' struggles. Whereas with reading and ELA, writing, those things come very naturally to me. That's what I excelled at as a kid and growing up. And I learned that teaching reading and ELA it's a lot harder for me because it doesn't come so naturally. Mm-hmm. And it was through that first year of teaching, I taught second grade math science, that I fell in love with teaching math. And I know that elementary math is not the same thing as high school geometry or college algebra. That's not the same thing. But the foundations for those things start in elementary school. And I started to notice that there were several kids that I taught that had the same type of feelings towards math that I did growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It sounds you really kind of like faced your fear head on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did, yeah.
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 And it worked out well. So when you were helping these kids, you mentioned when you discovered this framework called the guided math framework, and that kind of helped maybe shift some of the anxiety. So could you just share with us a little bit, like maybe where you learned the framework or just an overall outline of how that was helpful?
Yeah, so this was during that same year. Mm-hmm. It was my second year teaching, so this was probably, I have to think about what year it was, probably 2011. Mm-hmm. And my administrator at the time, she came in my room one day and she said, "Marcy, we're going to send you to a half-day training at our local service center over something called math workshop." And I was like, "Okay, I'll do whatever you want me to do." And that's ultimately where I sort of began my guided math journey. That's where I say it started. So at this workshop, they essentially talked about how your core teaching should be taught in a small group setting while the rest of your kids are rotating through math centers, or I call them math stations, but math centers or math games and they are working independently on previously taught skills while you are doing your core teaching at the small group table. It was a half day training, so 3.5 hours. And I remember sitting in that training and thinking, it was kind of like I had my light bulb moment. And I said, this is what a kid like me needed growing up. Because I think back to my elementary teachers and even some of my high school teachers, and I love them. They are wonderful, wonderful educators. But I don't ever remember working one-on-one with a teacher. I don't remember playing any sort of game. I don't remember hands-on learning. All I remember are curriculum workbooks and overhead transparency sheets. That's all. I mean, that's just all I remember. And
Yeah.
maybe there was some of that, and I'm just not recalling that information. But I remember thinking to myself, this is what I needed growing up. And so I left that 3 hour training, and I thought, I was like, I am prepared for this. This is going to go great. And at the time, I did not know what the guided math framework was.
Okay.
I just had learned about something called Math Workshop, and I was going to go do it. And let me tell you, it failed.
Oh.
It it failed tremendously. I remember going home that exact night, and I don't know if you'll remember what mailbox magazines are, but they used to come in the mail. They were, I don't know like how many pages, but you could essentially like make copies of these file folder games. And that night I went home, grabbed these mailbox magazines. I went up to my school and I made all of these copies of from these mailbox magazines because I really thought that what I had learned that I could just go and just do. And it failed. It failed tremendously. I say that it was through trial and lots of error that I made this system work for me. And I share in my book about this story where at the time, me and my partner teacher, we had this giant closet that was in between our rooms. And that was always kind of like our go-to when, like, if one of us needed the other person, we could go in and we could just give the signal. And that represented like, hey, like I need you ASAP. And my mistake was I didn't have a plan. I really just thought that, okay, I'm going to put this group of kids together and I'm going to put this group of kids together and I'm going to give them this game that I made. They're going to figure out how to play the game on their own. And then I'm going to take this group of kids and we're going to sit at this little desk area and I'm going to teach to them. And I thought that was going to work. And it didn't. And there was one particular situation where I remember I'm trying this out. It's not working. The classroom management is total chaos. And these kids had taken one of these file folder games that I made and they ripped it in half. And I remember going into this closet and I gave my partner teacher, we called it the signal. And so she came in and I'm just bawling, like tears are streaming down my face. And that math anxiety was setting in because I'm like, I can't do this. Like I'm failing these kids. And she reminded me that just like we teach students a growth mindset, that we need to give ourselves grace and have growth mindset as well. And so, this was back 2012. And so Pinterest was a new thing. Like teacher social media was really brand new. It wasn't really a thing. There wasn't a whole lot of information out there about what was called Math Workshop. So I dove into what little research I could find. And I learned about what is called the Guided Math Framework. It was created and developed by a lady named Lainey Sammons, who has kind of become my book OG. I don't even know. I think she's amazing for coming up with this. But I learned that it was essentially taking Math Workshop, but it broke your teaching into 5 essential parts. And those 5 parts are: you have a warm up, your whole group mini lesson, independent practice, your math, I call them math stations. A lot of people call them math centers. Math stations where your teacher table is one of those stations. So that's your rotations. And then the 5th is a reflection. And I learned about this, and it's essentially teaching you from shifting away from whole group instruction for 45 minutes to an hour to taking your whole group instruction and breaking it down into a 20-minute mini lesson. And then the rest of your time is spent teaching different groups at the small group table. And so it was over a course. I'm going to say, I want to feel like it probably took me a solid 2 to 2.5 years to really figure out what I was doing, because I was reading about this on the internet, and I had her professional development book, but because I was in a rural area, I never had an instructional coach, and I never had like a curriculum developer. I've never been to any fancy professional development, because when you're in a rural area, those school districts, they don't have those opportunities like a lot of larger areas do. And so I was just winging it. I was figuring it out on my own. And my first thought was, okay, I have to have a classroom management system put in place in order for this to work. And so I slowly started tweaking my classroom management while implementing the 5 pieces of the guided math framework. And I always say it's through trial and lots of error that I made that system work for me. And even as a veteran educator of 14 years, I mean, I still make mistakes to this day, but it's been one of the best things I've ever done as a teacher.
That's really awesome that you kind of put it together that way, because we do learn, unfortunately, sometimes the best through our mistakes, right? It does. It
Yeah,
teaches us,
absolutely.
yeah, in real time how to tweak it. And I think that'll be encouraging to a lot of teachers that are listening to that. That's kind of how it happened. So maybe we can like break down the steps a little more now that you've got them down, and develop them into something that that you really feel like is working well. So, and we don't want to give away too much of your book, but if those of us listening were like in your classroom and we were going to be doing a math lesson, what could you kind of describe what those steps would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, I actually break down how you can fit this 5-part framework into your own schedule, because one of the hesitations that I see with teachers is they say, well, I don't have enough time. And that's absolutely not true. And so in the book, I share, okay, if you only have 45 minutes to teach math, this is what you're going to do. And I walk teachers through a 45-minute, a 60-minute, a 75-minute, and a 90-minute math block. So I'll use an example for 60 minutes because that's typically what most teachers have. 90 minutes is ideal, but I realize that a lot of teachers don't have maybe have control over their schedule or that amount of time to teach math. But so let's say you have a 60-minute math block. You're going to start out with a 5-ish minute warm up. Think of this as the kickoff to your instruction. And how this typically works is you're reviewing a previously taught skill. This is not something that they are currently learning. This could be practice, like problem solving practice. This can be number talks. It can be a fluency game. It can be, something on a PowerPoint. It's something that takes no more than 5 minutes and you're reviewing a previously taught skill. So I'll give you one example. It's the one that I share most often. It's one of my personal favorites because kids love it, and it's called Beat the Teacher. And how it works is I say, okay, boys and girls, today we're going to play Beat the Teacher, and I put them into groups of maybe 3 or 4 kids. And then each group has a whiteboard. And I say, okay, your job today is you have 2 minutes. You could give them 1 minute, 3 minutes, however long you want, depending on your age level of kids. And I'm going to write a blank math fact on the board. So it might be equations that equal 5. It could be addition, subtraction. If you teach upper grades, it could be multiplication or division. But I'll write on the board, okay, your job today is to write addition facts that equal the sum of 12. You have 2 minutes to write as many math facts that you can think of that equal the sum of 12. While you're writing your math facts, I'm also going to be writing math facts on my board, and we're going to see at the end of 2 minutes if you can beat the teacher and come up with more math facts than I have. And typically I'm writing very slowly because you do want them to think that they can actually beat you. And sometimes they actually can. And then those final 2 minutes, I let groups stand up. They get to call out different math facts that they came up with that equal the sum of 12. And it's just a way to just explore, different types of equations. You can do it with addition, subtraction. You can do mixed facts. All kinds of things, but that just kind of gives you a quick example of something that you can do to review a previously taught skill. Then once your warm-up is over, you're going to move into your whole group mini lesson. And this is where teachers typically have to make the biggest transition, because you're going from spending the whole time standing up in front of your class and teaching from either a workbook or a PowerPoint or a video or something from your curriculum to really condensing what you're teaching in 30 minutes or less. Typically around 20 minutes is really kind of what you're wanting. And inside the book, I actually teach like a framework for how you can structure your mini lesson, like minute by minute. Like, this is what you need to do first, this is what you need to do second, and so forth.
Okay.
But during your whole group mini lesson, this is when you're either introducing or you're reviewing the skills that you are currently teaching. So during this time frame, you might be creating an anchor chart. Maybe you are modeling something with manipulatives. You are showing a video. And during this time, it shifts from teacher-led instruction and then to doing it from I do to we do. So you would model it, then the teachers are or your students are gonna model with you and practice what they just learned. Then you're gonna shift into the independent practice portion, which is where you're essentially turning them loose and letting them practice what they just learned independently. So this could be, again, used with manipulatives. I'm a big math journal person, so it could be work inside your math journals. Maybe you're doing part of a page from a curriculum workbook, but you're just allowing them time to practice what they just learned independently, and then you as the teacher, you're walking around and you're addressing misconceptions. But this is where whole group instruction lacks, because you can't get to every single misconception that a student might have. So once your whole group and independent practice is done, you shift into your math stations or your rotations, centers, workshop, whatever you would like to call it. And this is essentially where a strong portion of your classroom management has to come in. And if you have 60 minutes, so you're going to spend 5 minutes on your warm-up, and then you're going to spend about 20 to 25-ish minutes on your whole group mini lesson and independent practice. So those are kind of combined together, which leaves you 30 minutes to have your station time. And your stations are set up. There's so many different ways that you can set up and run stations, and I walk you through several different examples in the book. I kind of just taught myself, and so I have just stuck with the same system, but I keep it very simple. I have 5 rotations. I call them station 1, station 2, station 3. Real clever, I know. Technology, and then there's the teacher table. And so we rotate through various activities. And so stations 1, 2, and 3 are a previously taught skill that I know students can do independently. And then there's the technology component, and then there is the teacher table. And the teacher table is where you are providing targeted, differentiated small group instruction based on what your students actually need. And so with a 60-minute math block, what I typically recommend and what I have done in the past is I would have 2 rotations per day. Because unless you have essentially 2 hours to teach math, you're not going to get through every single group every single day. And I walk you through how you can create your schedule and what that also looks like inside the book. But my goal would be to have two 15-minute rotations a day. So one group would come to me at the small group table for 15 minutes. When time is up, we would clean up and they would rotate to their next spot, and then the next group would come to me for 15 minutes. And then the final part is a reflection. Some teachers like to do a reflection every day. I personally only do it maybe every other day, 3 times a week. And that can consist of an exit ticket or, coming together as a class and sharing what they learned today, what went well, what didn't work well, what can we change. And as that's kind of like essentially wraps up what you've done for the day. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that answered your question.
It does. No, it does. That's really good. I was sitting and thinking like that seems, first of all, kind of like you said at the beginning, that could work at any grade level, right? And like
It can work for any grade level, and it can work in any amount of time frame.
Okay. And I was thinking in maybe a high school where some high schools have like the 90-minute block. And that'd be awesome if that was every day. But yeah, you could be flexible with it, which is really cool.
You can be flexible with it. And what I've told teachers, again, I only have experience at the elementary level, but I have spoken with some, middle school and high school teachers, and they definitely they can take the framework itself and adapt it to a much more, I don't know if mature level is the right word, because, like my student groups are named after animals, so they're probably not going to want to have that.
Right.
But it's their stations or their independent activities look a lot different than what they would in an elementary setting. Mm-hmm. But the framework itself, the warm-up, the whole group lesson, your independent practice, stations and reflections can be used with any grade level.
Yeah, that could all be the same. Yeah. And it seems like it would be a lot less overwhelming, like as the student, as opposed to just sitting and having to go through problems in a workbook, like independently, like you were talking about. So yeah, that's very cool. And do you think with all those steps, like, is there one that teachers might underestimate? Like they might think, that's not really important.
Honestly, I'm going to say small group instruction at your, that's part of your station rotations. But I say like that's where the magic happens. That is where those light bulb moments click for even the most reluctant learners. And here's what's great about small groups is that when you teach in a whole group setting, and when you have a kid like myself growing up, if I needed help, I never really raised my hand because I didn't want people to know that I didn't know the answer.
Exactly.
Or that I didn't understand. And so like sometimes I would ask for help, but I would be like, oh yeah, like I got it. Or I might be like looking over at what, little Johnny's doing next to me and copying what he's doing. I mean, essentially that's what happens. And with whole group instruction, you miss a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of distractions, and it's not like that when you're teaching in a small group setting. You can easily address student misconceptions right away because you're right there in front of them. You have no more than 6 students in front of you. So if there's a misconception or if they have a question, they are more likely to open up and ask questions in that small group setting. Whereas in a whole group setting, they're going to be more reluctant. Mm-hmm. So when you are teaching in small groups, not only are you teaching on their academic level, but you're building trust with your students and helping them realize that, hey, like you can still do it no matter what. And you can, like I said, you can address misconceptions. You can fix student behavior. And there's just a lot more that you can hone in on that you cannot do in a whole group setting.
Okay. And with the groups, is there like a particular way that you decide how kids should be grouped? Is it just random, or do you base it on like your own observations or data, or is there like a way you do that?
Yeah, this was another thing that I really messed up on
Oh.
in the beginning because I had no idea what I was doing. I just, like I said, it's through trial and error that I made this work for me. But ultimately, what it comes down to is you have to know your data.
Mhm.
And I know that that can be a scary word. A lot of teachers are like, I don't have time for that. But it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And I actually share in the book several different types of data that you can use from informal observations to using exit tickets or pre and post assessments. You can use data from if you have an online program that your school uses, such as like IXL or ESGI or things like that. There's lots of different ways that you can look at your data as a whole and identify student misconceptions because typically if you have one student having a misconception, you're going to have probably two or three that are also having that misconception.
Right.
So you have to look at your data points and then you have to plug in the gaps. What are these kids missing and what do they need? And it's by looking at that data, whether it be formal or informal, your own teaching observations, because most of the time you know exactly what your kids need. And then I pull groups based on, inform my groups based on their ability and what they need specifically. And so I look at my data. That data also helps me identify my teaching points. That's going to be exactly what I need to be focusing on during those targeted 15-minute lessons at the small group table. When it comes to your schedule, whether you have 45 minutes or 90 minutes, you have to be realistic. And I explain this in the book that not every day is going to go the way that you plan.
Right.
And knowing that that's okay. You know, some days if you have if you have a 90-minute math block, I typically recommend 3 station rotations at 15 to 20 minutes each, you know, depending on your time frame. But some days realistically, you might only get to 1, you might only get to 2. Some days it might not work because of student behavior, or you have an unexpected fire drill, or a mom walks in with cupcakes and you had no idea that mom was coming, and you're like, okay, thanks for coming. I'm so glad we have to stop math so that we can have sugar. But realistic things happen. And what I love about this framework is that it's not about being perfect. You know that phrase like oh my gosh, my brain just progress over perfection.
Perfect. Yeah, yeah.
And that really is true when it comes to this.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it doesn't go perfectly the first time or the second time or the 10th time, or in my case probably like the 100th time, I can't even I could write a whole separate book on the mistakes that I made. But just knowing that mistakes are going to happen, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Some days you might only teach a whole group lesson and then you have to do a worksheet, and that's perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
But just knowing that, giving yourself grace and knowing that there's going to be mistakes, and you don't have to get to it every day. I always say I didn't get to my stations every single day, but every day I tried.
Mm-hmm.
I always just tried my best, and at the end of the day it ended up being okay.
Yeah. Perfection isn't the goal.
Yeah, perfection's not the goal. The progress is the goal.
And then kind of moving towards thinking about the impact that you've seen like on students. Do you have any stories about students that you've seen who were positively impacted by this?
I do. You know, and without getting like specific or naming student names, but
Right.
I have seen, I'm gonna call them myself. It's like I've seen myself like looking in the mirror, a little boy or a little girl, and they hate math. They don't like it. They don't enjoy it, and it makes them feel not smart. And I know what that's like, and I can really relate to those kids. And a lot of times, I'll tell them, I'll say, Mrs. Bernethy, she didn't like math one time. And, one time maybe we were doing this and I started crying because I didn't understand. And because I can relate to them, they feel more comfortable opening up. But one time, I had a little boy. He moved in mid-year. I don't remember where exactly he moved in from, but he was very below grade level. And he came to me mid-year. He was also one of those kids that he didn't really talk a whole lot. He was very shy. And I could tell when doing our whole group instruction that everything was just going in one ear and out the other. There was no motivation. He really lacked understanding and just basic foundational skills that he needed for second grade. And my heart just really went out to him because I understood what he was going through. And so I made it a point where, because he was so far behind, and I'm not going to say I wouldn't typically recommend this, but this was actually one year I had a very small class. So again, keep this in mind. Rural school, I only had 13 kids. So with this particular situation, I was able to do that. The school I'm in now, I wouldn't be able to do this, but I was actually able to pull him one-on-one. So because my class was so small, he was the only kid that came to me. Like when it was his turn to come to me, it was only him. And I was able to really hone in on what he needed at the time, not what the curriculum or the scope and sequence is telling him that he needs. I was able to go back and do simple interventions with him that allowed him to slowly, over time, start to build those foundational skills that he was missing. And like I said, I only had him for about half of a year, so I didn't have him a full year. But he was one of those kids that, I said he came in, he was really quiet, he was really shy, but I got to work with him one-on-one and build his mathematical confidence. And I was invited to his high school graduation last year. And it's one of those things where I don't even live in the same town. I don't even live in the same state as this little boy anymore. But it's just little things like that make you realize that, as a teacher, you're going to make mistakes, but being able to work in such a small group setting, I was able to develop that relationship with him that I couldn't build in a whole group setting, even if I had 13 kids. And I was just able to have conversations with him and help him break things down in really tangible ways. And not knowing it at the time, he was kind of one of those ones, he left, he had made a lot of progress, but he's just one of those ones, that when you leave, he leaves you, you're like, you really want them to just continue to succeed and to, and to continue to grow, but you don't know. I ended up moving, I ended up changing schools, and I never saw the little boy again, but I did. I got invited. He invited me to his high school graduation last year.
That's so awesome. How fulfilling for you.
Yeah, it was awesome. I was unable to go, but I FaceTimed with him. Yeah. It was really cool.
Just to know that he made it all the way, right? Yeah, made it to that finish line. That's really awesome.
Yeah.
And that probably feels kind of like a full circle moment.
It
and
was.
I was thinking about you as well. This is a more personal question, sort of tied back to the beginning. So how has this framework helped you to feel more confident about math and about, obviously you're teaching it and having good results. So how has that helped you?
The title of my book is called Small Groups, Big Impact, A Confident Teacher's Guide to Math Instruction, because I was the kid who struggled. And I was the teacher that went into this really not knowing. I know it sounds silly, but feeling like I was going to fail these little 7 and 8 year old boys and girls because that's how much fear and anxiety I had. And then, it's like I said, once I realized that I really loved teaching math, that I could break things down in tangible and hands on ways, I started to love it. Um, and I'm the type, I'm kind of like a research nerd. I like to grow as an educator, and I always say that some of the best educators out there are the ones that are willing to grow and learn right along with their students, because there's nothing wrong with whole group instruction. It's a vital part of teaching. Everyone has to do it. But when you look at a lot of the national statistics, which I share several of them in our book, there's so much heavy emphasis on ELA and literacy, and there should be. But there's also a huge mathematical literacy problem in the United States that often gets overlooked. And education is evolving and it's constantly changing. It's 100 times different than when I started out 14 years ago, and it's changing every single day. And I just feel like teachers, you need to be willing to grow and adapt and learn new practices that are going to benefit all of your students rather than just the ones that are going to catch on quickly.
Yeah.
And so, when I learned about this framework and I dived in and I started learning, and I just fell in love with it. And I think it was because it was just something that I needed. And I felt like if I would have had this type of instruction when I was a kid, I would have been a lot better off. And I just wish that that's something that I would have had. So when I started learning about it, and I think that's why I kind of dove into it, and really just fell in love with it, because I've just personally experienced it, I realized that this is what kids need.
What would you say now to maybe a teacher who is in a classroom and they still feel anxious about teaching math? Is it kind of like do the framework, or do you have any other tips for them?
Yeah, I feel like that's hard. Well, it's hard because there's lots of reasons why someone could experience having mathematical anxiety. And I think for me personally, and what helped me break through my anxiety and what I share with teachers is that think about what you're doing right now in your classroom. And when you're teaching math, what are you doing that makes you not happy? And for me, it was workbooks, because I realize, like, curriculum workbooks, they're necessary. They are required in a lot of school districts. I've been very fortunate enough that I can supplement with my own materials, or other materials. And I am a very hands-on teacher. I like to work with manipulatives and provide real-world experiences. I do a lot of work with math journals and interactive notebooks, and we use worksheets and workbooks from time to time, but I always say I'm not a traditional worksheet teacher. And I always actually tell my parents that as well. I said, you're not going to see a lot of worksheets come home in their folder every single day, because I'm not that kind of teacher. And it took me shifting my mindset and breaking through that traditional approach and willingness to try something new. So if you're a teacher out there and you are struggling with math anxiety, or you just feel like what you're doing is not working, then think about trying a different approach that's going to provide kids with more of a hands-on learning experience. And for me, that was really it. Like, when I realized that I don't have to teach this way, and I can actually make math really fun. And if I want to, bust out like some fun manipulatives, or if we want to play a game or something, like we can still do that, and kids they're having fun and they don't even really realize that they're learning. Does that make sense? And so I think it's just, if you are struggling, first of all, what is the pinpoint? What is causing you to feel that anxiety when you're teaching? And then looking at it from the perspective, okay, is this how I was taught growing up? Because for me, it was the workbooks. That's what triggered the anxiety. And when I learned that I could shift away from not being a traditional worksheet style teacher, that's when things changed for me.